My name is Dean Hachamovitch. I worked at a software company for about 20 years, and I'm a member of the board of the Arendt Center. So I guess by some taxonomy here, I'm a technologist. On my left is Mr. Soltani, who is currently serving as the chief technologist for the Federal Trade Commission. He is a researcher focused on privacy and security. He co-authored Washington Post's series on the NSA, which was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service, among several other prizes. He has testified in front of US Senate committees. Looking around this audience, my bet is that most of you have heard him on NPR. By matter of introduction, I should say that this might be the first moment today that the stage has no lawyers on it, and thus there is a higher expectation of direct answers to questions from the audience. Feel free to start preparing direct questions now. By way of context, today you've heard from scholars skilled in the art of law and politics and philosophy. From their point of view, privacy really involves issues historically like abortion and sexuality and marriage and the right to die. And all of this changes because technology. The conversation now, as you've heard so far, involves how we communicate, how we entertain ourselves, and how we shop. And for the sake of starting on a question that I think is at the top of everyone's minds, you're an accomplished technologist. Stepping back from all the mechanisms in technology, very concretely, what is the harm when apps and websites track us and know us?
Great. And I have to say, well, thank you for having me. And I have to say the views here are my own. They're not of my employer or anyone that I've ever worked with. They make me say that. So, there's a number of ways we can think about this question of what's the harm. This is often used as justification for collection. One way I like to think about, first of all, I should say I hate the word privacy. I've worked on the topic for a long time, but I can't stand the word because I don't think it well describes some of the technologically related issues that are generated. For me, I tend to think of things as information and information asymmetries, right? Oftentimes the concern is that someone has some information about me that either can be used to take advantage of me, to harm me, to exert control over me, and sometimes I know that they have that information, other times I don't, and the difference in the amount of information or how that information is used is what creates the harm. And one way I've often liked to think about this issue in the area of data is around, and some of you may have heard me talk about this before, is to use a metaphor of nuclear radiation, right? And this seems like a far stretch, but I'm just going to kind of work with me for a second. So radiation exists all around us, just as does information, right? It's out there, we exude it from just walking around, the lights around us, the sun, our reflections. And by itself, it doesn't exert kind of too much harm. We can withstand some amount of radiation without any adverse effects, right? But if someone were to take that radiation and aggregate it, bring it together and enrich it, to enhance it with additional data, then that radiation, that in itself has some potency, some potential for harm. It can be used to create energy and a great potential for good. It can be used to create weapons and a great potential for bad. But simply even just the aggregation and creation of this potent form of information, or sorry, potent form of energy can cause harm in the form of breach or risk. And that's how I like to think about information, right? So there's information about all of us from almost all of our activities, walking through the street, interacting, shopping, etc. And for a long time, that information was ephemeral. It would not be collected. It would not be aggregated. It wasn't directly linked with us. The store owner knew that person bought a pack of cigarettes, but they might not know you by name. They could not tie it back. But a lot of that has changed now. with the drive of advertising, with the drive of commerce, with the drive of just kind of the digital exhaust created by technology, just data logs, just by interacting with websites and services. There are now logs that link back all of this ephemeral behavior into ways that can be linked back to us and used in ways that could potentially hurt us. Either they can also benefit us, they can help us shop better or advertise to us better, but they also have the risk that someone will get access to information and use it in ways that we don't agree with. And so that's a long-winded way of saying what's changed is that ephemeral nature of information is now gone, and with it comes the risk of some information being used or aggregated or put together in a way that we don't desire it.
So over the course of today, we've heard about many different job candidates for the role of Big Brother. There's government, my employer, private corporations, schools. We've heard a little bit about individual malicious actors, much less foreign governments. Who did I miss, and how do you think about them?
Again, it goes back to the earlier point. To me, the model is there's a piece of information or some inferences about me, and there's some actor that might want to use it in ways that I don't believe it. It could be an employer, it could be a spouse, it could be a government entity. They all have different incentives, different roles, and oftentimes the key piece that's missed is that the ways by which the information is now able to be collected has radically changed, right? So if my employer or my spouse or my government wanted to surveil me, they would have to exert quite a bit of effort in doing so. They'd have to sneak around, they'd have to follow me, they'd have to kind of spend quite a lot of time figuring out what books I read or what content I'm observing. That's radically changed now. That information, those trails are now created just by virtue of the computers we use, the apps we use, the services we use, and that data exists in multiple places. Governments can go to the entities that collect that information, as we heard, with or without a warrant, to get aspects of our life. People can compromise our accounts, our account histories, our computers, and get insights to where we've gone and what we've seen. And that math has changed such that independent of who the actor is, the risk to me is now greater because there's this data trail. Does that?
It makes sense to me. We'll see in the QA if that works. And I think just one specific example is, someone could see that you're shopping for something, and different actors might lower the price to try to compel you to finally make the purchase, or an actor could choose to raise the price and profit perhaps less than fairly from it.
That's right.
And so part of that ambiguity, I think, comes out in your view. You're leaving gray room.
That's right. And I actually, I also worked for the Wall Street Journal trying to show some of the ways where information about us online is used. And one of the findings, we found sites charging different prices to people based on where they were located, what other sites they'd been to. One example was, depending on how far you were from a competitor's store, the Office Depot, for example, Staples would charge you higher prices for things if you were further away from a store, even though you were making those purchases online. And we found ways to manipulate where Staples thought we were in order to get lower prices for the same good. But they're able to make inferences and then use those inferences to charge people different prices. And so that's one way that information might be used. In classical economic terms, that's known as willingness to pay. They know your willingness to pay, or they can manipulate it such that they find your reserve price and extract maximum revenue from you, and they get essentially most of the social surplus.
So this is just my reminder before asking the next question. If you have questions, please prepare them, be ready. Again, there's no lawyerly preparation here. So this is a request for a war story. Could you describe the most interesting or provocative case or situation that you were involved with?
Sure. So I took a couple of notes of things to remind me. But I would say war story is for me, surprisingly, I don't have a lot of strong opinions of how things should be with regards to privacy, although, my fundamental kind of reference point is transparency or understanding. And to me, the most salient examples are things where either I did not know or people that I was working with are not aware of particular practices. And so hopefully by now everyone knows how the internet works and how the web works and how, when you browse online, in addition to the website you're visiting, other websites are tracking you and setting cookies on you in order to uniquely identify who you are, to then track you across multiple sites. So if you like pet food here and you go to a different website, you might like ads, they might show you ads about pet food, etc. So that's, 5 years ago, that was not that well known, and especially in the mobile environment with the degree of location information also being transmitted to third parties. But I think more and more we're seeing kind of new innovations in technology that I think are interesting that people would not be aware of. For example, how many people are aware of location tracking in malls? Do you know how this works? Does anyone raise a hand of? So good, a number of people. That's good. So like essentially, when you walk around major malls and major coffee chains and salad food chains, for example, they employ a technology called mobile retail tracking, which involves installation of devices in the mall or in the store that essentially look for emanations from your cell phone. So your cell phone's on, it's constantly either talking to a cell phone provider like AT&T or T-Mobile, or your Wi-Fi signal is on. And these companies will use those emanations to then identify your location in the store, whether you're a repeat visitor, perhaps other stores you've gone to, and they track you. And so that's not well known, but that's a technology for the purposes of, for example, providing better service to you at the store. So that to me is, again, one of these things where I don't think it's in the public debate, I don't think people realize it, but there are records of your visits to multiple stores just by virtue of your phone being on. Another one, for example, that I'm interested in is this move to what's known as cross-device or cross-channel tracking. So in the retail space, companies want to know when you see an ad on your phone and then you later go to your laptop computer and you buy it, or you read something on your tablet and then later you sign up for a service on your mobile phone. This is known as cross-device. They want to know that you're the same user across the same device, so they can do things like measure how many ads you've seen, measure the conversion of those ads when you've clicked on something and purchased something. That's called a conversion. And so the technology they use to do that, some is obvious, right? So some of the big players just rely on you being signed in to, say, Google or to Facebook on multiple devices. You know you're signed in on those two services, so it's not surprising that Facebook knows when they show you an ad on your mobile device and you later see it on your desktop, you're the same user. Some of the other techniques are much more surprising. They rely on behavioral habits, like your devices are in the same location at the same time, or you browse the same types of websites at the same hours of the day. One of the most surprising and interesting approaches to this, or techniques that I've seen, is essentially using ultrasonic emanations from your phone to your other device. So ad libraries, so advertising libraries that are embedded inside your mobile apps will essentially emit a silent pulse out of one phone, and then the other phone's microphone will be constantly detecting that any
So just to be clear, your devices are talking to each other about you?
They're just emanating, yes, that's right. And they're both doing it at the same time, and all of our devices are doing it. So they would have one data point, which is all of us are in this room together. But then later on tonight, only my other two devices, my personal phone and my cell phone, will be together. So they'll know, well, those are two data points. And over time, they can attribute those two devices as hanging out together or associated together based on the fact that the two phones are silently communicating. Again, something I don't think most consumers would know about, something that is hard to essentially find out ways to notify and alert people about so that we have choice, but ultimately has the result of bridging two devices' behaviors together in a way that would surprise and shock most people. And just to touch on that, why that's an issue is you might want to carry two devices and keep them separate. You might want to keep two parts of your life separate, my work or my home or my press. I was a reporter in a past life. My activity with sources and my activity with my normal life. There's a number of contexts in which I might want to keep those behaviors separate, but there is a push in industry to link those in order to, for example, provide better services or advertising, et cetera.
And with that, are there questions from the audience? I see a hand back there in a bright color I can't make out. Yes.
So I'm just kind of curious. I cover this topic too for a trade publication, and the more that I write about it, the more you talking about this retailers and how a lot of the public isn't aware of this going on. And then the FTC has clearly done a ton of work with telecoms and things like that. I'm just curious if you think there's a case to be made that this is unfair to consumers.
Yeah, I mean, so folks don't know, so the FTC, our authority is unfair and deceptive trade practices. So we can go after companies that are purely deceptive for the purpose of they lie to you about privacy practices. For example, in the area of privacy, we brought cases against Google and Facebook, Twitter and others for example, making representations to you about how your information will be used and then going against those representations and selling them or exposing your information. That's deceptive. That's kind of an easier hook. Unfair has kind of, it's not unfair in the natural way we think of unfair, but there's a bunch of legal thinking around what is unfair, and it's a practice that can't be reasonably avoided, doesn't have countervailing benefits, and does cause or likely to cause harm. And again, back to our original purpose or original question, what is the harm in collecting information? I don't think the Federal Trade Commission or the government is at a position where they can argue just the simple collection of information, especially when it's things like browsing behavior, is necessarily a harm. They've brought cases for things like exposing your private life from, for example, from a webcam installed inside your house. Perhaps that's closer to a harm, but just things like where you've been or your browsing activity, it's a much harder threshold. Not saying that they won't, but I feel like the balancing act, particularly for a trade regulator, right, someone that's involved in protecting consumers but also maintaining trade, is hard to just bring a pure harms case on a privacy issue. And one thing to think about is a part of it, or a lot of it, is that we don't have, so what I described to you is the unfair and deceptive rule. We are the primary privacy enforcer in the US. And so if that seems like a weak hook, that's because we in the US don't have baseline privacy rights regarding information as one does in Europe. Right? We don't have a framework that says, I cannot collect your information. Right? We have a framework that says you should give consumers some notice and choice if you collect their information, but you don't have to. And that oftentimes, if there's a market benefit, you often have a trade-off.
I think just one very specific, concrete example of the US as compared to the European regime is if you go to news websites in the UK or in Europe, you'll notice that the first time you visit, there's a giant thing that flies up that says, we use cookies, and then it says something else, and then you click OK. And then you move on. And that practice, right, like the sites put those up because of specific legal reasons, and we have not yet had those here.
That's right. So they require consent, and even there's some question as whether providing an interstitial, a click before you see the content, is actually consent. But they're required to get consent before collecting your information or setting a cookie, whereas in the US you don't. One thing that actually reminds me of is the earlier conversation, though, with David Brin about whether this essentially determinism of this is the way the world is because of our participation in it, and this is the world it's going to be. One thing about this cookie issue that's worth noting is that it didn't actually have to be this way. So it didn't necessarily have to be that a number of websites outside of the site you visit. So when I visit the New York Times, I might get 50 other third-party companies that are tracking what I read on that website. There was a great article on the New York Times, funny enough, a couple weeks ago about the cost to, just in terms of bandwidth costs on a mobile device. You pay about $10 in mobile bandwidth for allowing these third parties to set and serve you content.
So effectively, consumers subsidize the surveillance of consumers.
That's right. That's right. Right. But what's funny about this whole thing is it didn't actually have to be this way. So 20 years ago, I doubt anyone in this room is, maybe with the exception of us two, are old enough to remember NCSA Mosaic. Do people remember? This was like, sweet. So one of the first browsers, or I think the first kind of big browser, which then became Netscape. At that time, there was a big decision as to whether to request permission from the user to set cookies, and then whether first-party cookies and third-party cookies should be treated the same. And some engineers in a room decided, you know what, these pop-ups are annoying, we're just going to accept cookies, and you know what, let's just leave third-party cookies, let's treat them the same as first-party cookies. Those little technical decisions essentially gave rise to this huge advertising industry that we have now that we rely on for content, but it also became essentially the basis for a lot of the privacy invasions that we have now. And it could have very well gone a totally different direction. And we're kind of seeing that right now with the rise in ad blockers, where people are essentially blocking ads and essentially blocking third-party content and saying, no, we don't want others tracking us on a website. But that could have been the norm, right? We could have had a tip jar for when we read a news website and been allowed to protect our privacy and not allow other websites to track us. But that was just a technical decision made by some engineer at a point in time, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the way it is. And we are seeing some advances by some companies to provide more privacy-preserving technologies and build in privacy protections into technology. So I don't accept the notion that it can only be this way because it's the way it currently is.
I'm sorry, down in front here, there are two questions. Sorry.
Related to the point of ad blockers, I feel like consumer acceptance of current practices in the United States is founded largely on ignorance. And as soon as we learn, oh, wow, cool, I can actually download something to block the ads, what a pain. Okay, it's on my to-do list. I'll do it next week. I have to figure out how to do it, and I'll get around to it because it's I have to affirmatively opt out of it, which makes it difficult. So if you don't view this question as too much of an intrusion on your personal privacy, right, I'd be very curious to hear how you conduct your personal technology affairs and hygiene. And
sure,
if you're super scrupulous because you're the most educated kind of consumer, and maybe how would we all
sure,
behave in a world of perfect information?
Right, and so three things actually that I can talk on. One, absolutely, you could argue that this ecosystem exists because of the lack of awareness, and some of the examples I described earlier around mall tracking or cross-device tracking, I suspect there's not a lot of awareness. And one thing we have to realize is that's going to always accelerate, right? That the incentive is on the side of companies, right? So it might be worth, even if I value my privacy enough for $10 worth of privacy to install an ad blocker, right? As an individual, each of us would have to make that determination. Whereas a large multi-billion-dollar company that relies on ad tracking, for them to figure out the new technology to track you, they have a $50 billion incentive, right? So unless we all decide in unity that we believe this is an important factor, they always will have much more incentive. It's the collective action problem. Two, to the degree that people are making individual decisions about ad tracking and ad blocking and their privacy preferences. One might argue that so to your example of you finally decide to install an ad blocker, right? You value your privacy enough at some point to bother downloading it and install an ad blocker. What happens when this website says we won't show you the content unless you disable your ad blocker, right?
Which is actively happening.
Which is actively happening. With the websites now, if you have an ad blocker, will say, sorry, we won't show you the content, you have an ad blocker installed, right? Do you care about your privacy enough to then say, oh, okay, I'll either uninstall my ad blocker or pay you or sign up for a service, right? And so that's the next level, and it's a constant test to see how much do we value our privacy. I think we can try to create an environment which is the other side of the same coin or whatever, which is perhaps figure out, is there a number with which we could convince publishers to rely on our payment rather than tracking and advertising. And just a small aside, has anyone heard of Google Contributor? Do people know this? Raise of hands. So this is a funny project. So Google is actually hedging their bets. There's a project called Contributor, which is a small Skunkworks project which you can sign up for, which you can pay $5 or $10 a week, I think the number is, to Contributor, and Contributor will pay publishers small micropayments that are part of the network in exchange for showing you less ads. So they're already experimenting with this. Granted, you have to trust Google to do it, and you have to then, it's only a subset, but it's interesting that people are exploring alternative models, and I'm not sure if that's better or not, but that's just,
I'm sorry, it also appears to be in direct response
That's right.
to the increased use of ad blockers.
Ad blockers, that's right. And then for my personal hygiene, the clear answer is it depends, right? So I use Twitter, I use Facebook, I use certain technologies for things I want to disclose. I also, I root all my devices, and I essentially pipe my traffic through kind of an analyzer that I work with that helps look at what data is being transmitted. I also, when I want to be private, I will not bring those devices with me, or I will not use certain technologies. I did work on the Snowden files with the Washington Post, and in that context I had much different OPSEC and much different protocols. But ultimately, finally, there are things that I won't do online, right? And to me, it's more a question of an incentive. If there are certain things that either nation-state actors would want to find or find out about that I feel like I don't have the resources to defend against, and in those contexts, I won't do those things online or in a digital manner.
So I just want to, one other bit, however you feel about ad blockers, when you read up on them and you discover that some ad blockers actually accept money from publishers to let certain ads through, you realize just how complex the situation is.
Right.
And it always seems to get more complex the more you look.
And there was a response earlier, which was that there was a fantastic question about whether, as technology becomes more pervasive, that the laws need to get nuanced. And I'm not sure if it's just that the laws need to get nuanced, but I think our understanding and our ability to parse and apply policy to technology needs to get much more sophisticated, right? Because nearly all of the disclosures you might have read about by the NSA, most of them involved, for example, the ability for their technologists and their lawyers to work out vulnerabilities, not just in software and hacking, but vulnerabilities in the legal system such that they could perform somewhat legally the work they wanted to do. And you shouldn't fault them for it. Their mission is to provide and surveil to the best of their the ability. Who you should fault is us as the public and the policymakers for not addressing and providing policy to these vulnerabilities, right? These policy vulnerabilities, these legal vulnerabilities, these loopholes in the law that allow one particular FISA court to approve mass surveillance, or my favorite topic, which is the definition of collection versus so collection is different in NSA world versus acquisition. So in the kind of surveillance world, you can acquire content, which means you can take and record to a hard drive all content passing through certain pipes without necessarily being said to have collected it. Right? It's the tree falls in a forest. This is a philosophy crowd. Someone can figure this out, right? But their argument is that because no human eyes have fallen on the data, we have not collected it on it. We have not collected that data, and therefore there is no policy violation, right? And that to me is a really interesting parsing of a legal argument. But tell me what the right answer is.
Go ahead.
We have one or two questions on Twitter. If I'm going to just maybe put them both out and see if either of them are ones you want to take up, Ashkan. One is, what is the potentiality of health insurance companies using Fitbit data to determine costs of coverage? And what would that mean for people who are less fit or more fit?
I think the short answer is it's already happening. Yeah. So.
And the second one is that your onliner, who went to Bard briefly, suggests that we be momentarily compensated for corporate use of our data. Comments. So maybe either one of those that...
Sure. To the former, I don't know exactly in the health context, but we know in the car premiums market, our driving behaviors and are currently, at least in the US, it's voluntary, where I install a device on my car and I prove to the all watchful eye that I'm driving safe, and therefore I get a discount. Right? And so we call that voluntary until 70% of us are doing that, and then it becomes mandatory because everyone else pays insurance premium for not participating in that program. And to the second question of being compensated for the data, it's hundreds of scholars have provided this theory or presented this as an idea. My favorite paper is Pam Samuelson in 1999 wrote about this as information as a property right. There are some benefits, there are some severe limitations, most of which being stemming from the behavioral econ literature, which is another reason why we don't really value privacy is the same reason why we don't put on seatbelts in cars, right? And this is the behavioral economics. This is the thinking around low probability events, right? The likelihood of some sort of privacy harm directly affecting one of you is not necessarily in your immediate time horizon, and you might discount the likelihood that it's going to happen to you. And so whether it's to sell your information for a low amount of money, the non-sophisticated answer is lolcats, right? You will always pay to watch cats on the internet for some reason. I don't know why, but people do, and they'll trade their data for it, right? And it's not logical, but we like the immediate gratification. We like the satisfaction. Most times when we're doing that calculus, we're like, so what if we give our name just to watch this video? And oftentimes we will not do that math well.
Just one other example to the healthcare one. In a moment that made me think of the ACLU, there's a site that you can do a web search for called Unfitbits, and it's a variety of ways to have your Fitbit report results that you may not have actually done. For example, attaching a Fitbit to a power drill has all sorts of interesting results. Metronome as well. And there are a variety of interesting ways to, for lack of a better term, hack any system. We have college students and early college students here, and in an act of trying to discriminate against people in my own age group, I'd like to ask if there are college or early college students. The question? Yes, there is one question over there from someone who doesn't yet have a bachelor's degree.
Thank God for not going to grad school. So my question is, it's related to the whole Max Schrems thing that is going on right now. And, you briefly mentioned, the privacy rights in the EU are very different from what's going on in the States. But there's a hard push in the EU right now, or what I see as a hard push for privacy rights, and they're focusing on US-based companies. Do you think that that's going to have a policy change in the States, or do you think, what do you think the implications of that is?
That's a great question in terms of the implications. So for folks who don't know, the recent European Court of Justice essentially invalidated what's known as the US-EU safe harbor, which allows European consumers' data to be transferred to the US for processing. Typically, in the EU, states have to verify, nations have to verify that the companies and their consumers' data, companies collecting consumers' data have practices with regards to privacy and handling of the data and how that's processed. And this invalidation has created a huge burden for US companies that collect data from EU citizens. The answer is, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. We definitely now, US companies are now listening and scrambling to figure out, one of the responses is to have these model contracts that describe what the company's practices are. And there's additional work to potentially house Europeans' data in Europe, for example. I doubt it's going to go to that length. I think, but it does, I think, create a forcing function whereby US companies need to essentially play better with European law. Whether that's good or bad is unknown. One of the things to think about from the trade perspective is that most of the companies that have benefit from the collection of data are in the US, right? And so on one hand, you might say that's because the US had laxer laws with regards to privacy. On the other hand, there's more to lose for the US economy if those laws were to be applied to the US, right? And so I don't know what the policy outcomes are going to be. I suspect there's going to be some tightening of US restrictions or some balancing, but I actually don't know. I think it's a great wait and see question.
I just want to add one other. I completely agree with what you said. This is one of many, many laws that operate differently EU as compared to the US. Historical story from my past. If you have a chance to talk with the people, either on the US government side or on the US corporate side, who go and negotiate things with Europeans, there's a moment in the negotiation where they look at each other and all the Americans leave the room, because the Europeans are going to talk about their absence of a First Amendment right and how that affects the laws that they put into place for how people speak and communicate on the internet. And so it's interesting to look at the regime of data protection, which has got good and bad, and also look at other aspects that are different, because none of these really operate in a vacuum.
Right. So I'm not a lawyer, but so Europe doesn't have a First Amendment law, right? So the right to be forgotten, for example, operates in a very different fashion there.
Please join me in thanking Ashkan Soltani and Dean Hachamovitch.